which I'm glad to see all of you. And with this little exodus from the previous room. Peter Greenaway is one of the great filmmakers of our time. Here's a partial list of his films: The Draughtsman's Contract, Zed and Two Noughts, The Belly of an Architect, Drowning in Numbers, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover, Prospero's Books, The Baby of Macon, The Pillow Book and 8.5 Women, Nightwatching, and Rembrandt's J'accuse. In all his films, one finds a rare combination of elements: clever, complex scripts, stunning visual and musical messages that make watching his work a total experience. That such a complex works became popular is a miracle. Cinema has become a resting place for the mind, a place where one is free from work. Greenaway's films demand work. They challenge and stun the spectators. To enjoy them fully, one has to think hard. In a world where intellectual numbness has become the norm, this in itself is laudable. But it is not just films that Greenaway makes. He is a painter, a creator of installations, a writer, an experimenter, an educator. He plays with ideas, with images, with expectations, with definitions. I cannot but envy his free spirit, his willingness to take risks, his acerbic sense of humor. We invited him to our workshop to enlighten and challenge us. We historians take pride in not being the slaves of grand theories, like some of our neighbors in the science de l'homme. But the past, with which Greenaway often plays, can be as tyrannical as great theory. We are limited by our sources, by our footnotes, by the recurring patterns of past events, by the implicit explanatory theories that we adopt unwittingly. Greenaway is a man known for his cultural ability. We have agreed on certain elements in his talk, but quite frankly, I don't know what to expect. In a few moments, we won't have to speculate. Something particularly unnatural for a historian. Let's welcome him here.
I think that just a brief 5-minute talk, indeed with this gentleman just now, has given me a much greater and more valuable focus, perhaps, on what I imagine I'm going to say. One of my great cultural heroes is Buckminster Fuller, architect, guru, who could keep an audience enthralled for 8 hours. You are not going to sit here for 8 hours, heaven forbid, but there is a way that the subject matter, both from my subjective point of view and no doubt from your context, is incredibly huge. And I think we all necessarily are the centers of our own universe, and in a curious way, to be given opportunity to talk about oneself is surely absolutely ideal for each and every one of us. What I would like to do really is to build up to a very large autobiographical project that I engendered for myself at the beginning of the 21st century called the Tulslooper Suitcases. But I want to approach that maybe a bit crabwise and to talk about, I suppose, one of the most important things about examination of self is to talk about origins, and that necessarily is to talk about childhood, I think. Certainly the bane of the whole of a literary endeavor of Western Europe. Basically all novelists' first essays, first projects, first short stories, first novels are essentially about childhood and adolescence. There's no particular difference for me. Then I want to be able to talk about probably a major subject matter for me was indeed my association, again you'll be familiar with this, with my father. Not a very harmonious situation. I imagine a lot of you would also concur with that. But it is a way that I had to overcome, I suppose, that those characteristics of that relationship. And I did it, I think, probably using cinema as a sort of therapeutic way to be able to discuss dialogues that I, in fact, never had with my father. And then after that, as a preliminary, then I want to talk to you about this huge encyclopedic production, indeed, called the Tell Super Suitcases. All right, there's some fiddling going on here, as you can see. I hope it's all to your benefit. Can you all hear very well? Yes? Yes? Do I have to do anything else? Sign language? No? Good. My language obviously predominantly has to be English, so I cannot remotely talk to you in any other language. I understand you are all, in one way or another, sort of history enthusiasts, history students. I would need perhaps to understand how that impinges on every single one of you. I suppose that maybe I should lead off with one or two provocative statements that I don't think there is anything called history. There can only be historians. And since 90% of all the history that comes our way in whatever form is basically to do with text, why is it that most historians don't seem to be interested in image? You know, Genesis tells us that God asked Adam to go out and name everything. So we have this absurd idea that in the beginning was the Word. Absolute rubbish and humbug. How could Adam possibly name anything if there wasn't something to name? So the idea of object, of vision, of our eyes to appreciate the image is far more important and would easily subsume and prioritize any ideas about notions of text. Last year at the Venice Biennale, I was so incensed by this ridiculous proposition that indeed I had an installation called "In the Beginning Was the Image," and then tried very hard to demonstrate it. It's an uphill task, isn't it? The major form of communication all over the globe is essentially the word, across all the language barriers, across all the language difficulties. And I so very much aware of the fact that Umberto Eco said that all translators are liars. There is a way, of course, that we do have to negotiate some idea of translation, but it's very much to do with an inexact sense, indeed, of negotiation than any desperate attempt to be able to make a proper transliteration of one language into another. Several years ago, I made a film called The Pillar Book, which was based upon a female novelist living in Edo in Japan around about the year 1000. If you feel it's difficult to translate contemporary Japanese into contemporary modern Western languages, could you imagine how extremely difficult it would be to be able to go back 1,000 years? I've examined really, I suppose, literal translations of this female. You might know her name, Sei Shonagon, classic female, indoors, died at 25 of childbirth Japanese, and all that's associated with. The actual ability seemed to be light years away from our understanding. And then I suppose that in a curious way that all the art forms are forms of translation. My particular medium, my particular language is essentially cinema. But looking at this image we now have on the screen, it never began like that. I'm a filmmaker, I rather suspect by default. I always wanted to be a painter. I put that in the past tense. I still am a painter. I have a big exhibition in Madrid at this moment, and it continues to wander across Europe. But I've always believed there was something particularly elemental, existential about the notion of representation of the image, and ever since the tender age of 13 or 14, I always wanted, some way or another, to be associated with painting. Maybe in an academic way, I would talk about it, I would not practice it, but that became very insufficient for me. If I really seriously wanted to be able to concern myself with representation, with notions of painting and drawing, then I really felt I ought to have some very, very practical considerations. And ultimately, against everything in my family background, I eventually went to art school. Let me ask you a few questions, because I always think that dialogue is much more superior to simply one person solitary voicing opinions. You are all, I'm not quite sure really what you think a historian is. I mean, already I've made a provocative statement saying that you're probably all wasting your time because there is no such thing as history, there can only be historians. And every single one of you will know that probably the so-called great names, let's take some popular names, Julius Caesar and Winston Churchill, were outright liars. All historians write for very particular purposes. I don't think there's ever such a thing as pure history. Most of the historians we know what their vested interests were. If it wasn't for money or to please an emperor, it was out of some narcissistic desire to hear their own voice. So much so that you must surely be aware that there is a feeling that history is really only a branch of literature. I would strongly believe that, but I am English and therefore allowed to have tons of irony. And my tongue is often, of course, in my mouth. And isn't that another situation? Very, very few historians are humorists. Can you think of historians being humorists? You know, if your name was Seneca, of course, you couldn't dare to do that, as Caligula will make sure your head disappeared. But I do think, you know, since the notions of history are so transparent, we all ought to keep a very, very strong, ironic phase in our heads about what we're dealing with is basically unprovable. Okay, you might have all the documents, but probably all the documents are wrong. I remember many, many years ago when I was a kid trying to put together my family history. And of course, a lot of the people were still alive. And I knew that their birth certificates and their marriage certificates and their death certificates, supposedly regarded as truth, were all absolutely wrong. I knew that, I knew it. But all these sort of official people who apparently look after our bodies, whether they're alive or dead, seem to take enormous amounts of shortcuts. And if that's happening with the local coroner, my God, imagine what's happening across the length and breadth of academia and historical association. Am I saying things which you find intrepidly problematical? Do you think you want to be talked to by somebody who doesn't believe that history is in any way a viable situation? Can I have a reaction? Do both of you believe that indeed history is a fiction? Yes? Nobody's already up in arms to deny and argue with me. I don't hear anything, no? Are you allowed to speak? Are you encouraged to speak? What are Israeli audiences like? Are they generally timid and non-responsive or hugely argumentative? No?
The latter.
Too shy. I never thought of the Israelis being shy. Very bombastic, exhibitionist people, I always thought. Is that justified, you think? All right, well, let's see what emerges. I have, I suppose, many thanks to the introduction, which of course, as always, is somewhat over the top, but introductions probably need to be a bit like that. There is a way that, I don't know how I should posit this. I mean, let me ask another leading question, and please don't be shy. Are there people in the audience who've actually seen any of my films? A goodly show of hands. And I imagine that those would be probably the commercially available items. I rather suspect probably the most popular film I've ever made is indeed called The Cook, Verfi, His Wife and Her Lover. And there have been many people in the audience who have seen that.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think by any manner of means it's my best film, but it is, I am told, very approachable, certainly as regards a number of the other movies. Let me then say that I'm not really very interested in cinema. Again, another provocative statement. I feel maybe I'm being very churlish here, but cinema, after all, supposedly was only invented in 1895 by the Lumiere brothers. I don't believe that for one moment. I think cinema was created in the early 17th century by 4 painters who began to concern themselves with problems of artificial light. Cinema is all about artificial light. and you probably know those four painters. They were all alive at the same time, though not exactly contemporary. The first one was Caravaggio, the second one was Velázquez, the third one was Rubens, and the fourth one was Rembrandt. They're all existing between 1580 and probably about 1660. Some of them were grandparents when the others were still very young, but there were at least 12 years when they were all alive at the same time. And I think their particular fascination, relevant not only to the history of painting, but to ideas about cinema, is they were the first people to paint artificial light. Of course, there are painters who are painting before, I suppose, the year 1600, about notions, should we say, of candlelight, firelight, and so on, but they're few and far between. Relative to basically the human condition before about 1600, that everybody went to sleep when the sun went down and didn't start work again until the sun came up. Impossible to, I suppose, what's that phrase, to burn the candle at both ends, because candles were atrociously expensive. And the only people who could afford them were certainly in the West, would be the church, and probably the upper aristocracy. But just think how many bees are necessary to make one candle. So very, very few people could actually afford to be able to work at all in any circumstances by artificial light. But suddenly there was a new technology in Western Germany, centering in Bremen, that candles started to be made of animal fats, which was 1,000 times more cheap. And then gradually the middle bourgeoisie and even maybe some members of the proletariat were able to be able to afford these candles made of tallow, animal fats. And gradually, I suppose, within about a decade, or within certainly a generation, painters who were always on the forefront of any, I think, human activity whatsoever, like every single thing in this room, and apart from you organic creatures, I see no plants, so everything in this room had to be man-made, down to your socks and your underwear, and the top of the chain of the idea of designing and everything that's man-made is always the painter. The painter is at the top of the chain of all design. There's an extraordinary, rather beautiful but enigmatic anecdote. You probably all heard of the Italian-Swiss painter Giacometti. Giacometti said that your grandmother probably knows absolutely nothing about Picasso, but be absolutely certain that Picasso knows everything about your grandmother. Two of my heroes, one would be Chaplin, the other would certainly be Eisenstein. Both really hated the idea of the introduction of sound cinema, as it at one fell swoop took everybody away from the business of looking, and forcing them to rely on text, or those intertitles, of course, to begin with, and then much more later with notions of a soundtrack. You know that really depressing, melancholic situation? I'm sure that you're all good gallery goers. When you go to the Louvre, or you go to your big national galleries, indeed, in this city, you can watch how people look at painting. They peer anxiously, and most people, of course, and I suspect you too, are all visually illiterate. Do any of you actually think that you are visually literate? I'm sure you're extremely sophisticated in terms of text. A lady put her hand up rather tentatively in the middle. That was an accident, putting your hand up, was it? No, but when you think about all the energy, all the imagination, all the learning, all the years of slog that you organize yourselves to understand and communicate with text, there are very, very few people who actually spend all that energy, all that imagination on the image. Would you not agree? I don't think it's necessarily your fault. I'm not going to remove the blame entirely from you, but it really is to do with the educational systems of the world, isn't it? And I'm sure it's part and parcel of your education here. You know what happens when you are about 10, 11, or 12? The teacher says, put away the crayons, take down the easel, put away the paints. You're going to have to get serious now. And basically, from about that age, just before the beginnings of adolescence, you drop out of the notion, indeed, of even using the image as a language for your own self-satisfaction, for your own sense of representation, for your own sense of well-being. As you know, children naturally are extraordinarily good visualists and artists. Give them a pen or a pencil and they're off. But it seems to be our education system, whether you live in Japan or whether you live in Seattle. So somehow, for most people, 90% of people, that begins to disappear. And isn't that tragic? We all live now, certainly in Western world, certainly to about 80, females longer. So if you live for 80 years and you've given it all up at 10, that means 70 years of barren deserts. You no longer even think about the image very largely. You certainly don't make it part and parcel of your life, and you don't engage in it either as a material possibility, either as a spectator or indeed as a creator. Great, great tragedy. I wanted once upon a time to be the cultural minister of the UOK, and I was determined to be able to reset education, to make it at least be 50% of human experience, and still probably a miserable, 10%. I'm not so sure this will change. I've got to convince people, and I know there are a lot of other people who, of course, belong in the same sort of boat as me, but it'll be an incredibly uphill task. So what have I said already? Let me just try and encapsulate that. You can see my enormous amount of enthusiasm for the image. You think that I think now that most people are visually illiterate. I still like that lady to be able to support her argument, even though she only too tentatively put up a finger. Are you telling me the truth now? Are you trying to be like Trump and denying, are you? No?
I totally agree with you.
Good. All right. At least one person in the audience will agree with me. So, at the tender age of 12 or 13, living in a household where there were no paintings on the wall and comparatively few books, I will support one particular activity that came from my family, that they were certainly not, I suppose, members of the proletariat, not particularly well endowed with education. Probably most of them left school certainly at 16. But they did have an extraordinary observational knowledge of the natural world. My father was an ornithologist, but don't think of him as an academic. He probably wouldn't have known the Latin name of any bird, but he, rather like I could up to the age of 5, could recognize any European bird by its sound alone. He set up, with a number of more perhaps educated ornithologists, a whole series of bird reservoirs around Northern Europe. That's one of the reasons why I got to know Holland so well. Holland is the ideal place to watch birds. It's on the Atlantic seaboard, and it's very flat, and most of it, of course, maybe I exaggerate a little, let's say 2/3 of it is water, either fresh water or seawater, and it's an absolute haven for migrating birds that come swelling up from North Africa and the Mediterranean in the spring and all go back again in the autumn. My father used to drag me, and I have a brother younger than me, to the marshes of North Holland to simply watch birds. I have memories, not all of them unpleasant, of being freezing cold with a pair of binoculars stuck to my eyes, wearing a pair of his cast-off gaiters, which came up onto my armpits, wading around in mud and seawater. But it did rub off, didn't it? It's rather strange that, however antagonistic or unsympathetic we are to the circumstances of our parents, I have 4 children, and the 2 eldest absolutely hated being dragged around museums in London on a Sunday afternoon and simply wanted to be at home. But one's now a sculptor and the other's now a jeweler. Not in any way pressurizing, but just the circumstances of a background does, in a sense, inevitably wear off. I have 2 much younger children now, and it's far too soon, but I can see probably, unfortunately, one wants to become a filmmaker. I'm trying very hard to discredit that notion. So, the idea then, the primacy of the image, was related, I suppose, to this extraordinary knowledge that my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. As I said, my father was an ornithologist, my grandfather was a rose grower, and my great-grandfather used to look after a forest in East London. So they knew, you know, by sniffing the air and by looking at the berries in September and seeing how high the birds nested in the trees, an awful lot about natural history. But I always had this great problem about its ephemerality. Nothing ever stayed still. Everything was constantly on the move. And this caused all sorts of anxieties. How old am I? How anxious? How many anxieties can you have when you're 13? But I decided somehow or other that there ought to be some permanence here. And one of the ways I could see that would be to trap it, to hold it down. I remember some of the first criticisms of my cinema were offered by the London Time Out, and a critic there said, Mr. Greenaway's films suffer, rather like butterflies suffer. They will only be collected and stuck with a pin and fixed down, which somehow makes their reality or their unreality somehow unprepossessing. I have to say that that particular gentleman eventually did become one of my producers, so we did not end up enemies. So I think then that desire to fix the natural world became, I suppose, the wellspring for me, first of all, indeed, to wish to become a painter. And then I was in inhabited London art schools in the 1960s, swinging London, the whole sort of music scene, etc. We were the first generation after the Second World War to begin to have a separate identity, not to exactly dress and behave like our parents. And so it created a culture which I like to believe, certainly at that time, was extremely wide open to all sorts of activity. Seeing my own children in later generations, that sense of freedom and opportunity seeking and a desire for the most expansive encyclopedic education you could find have since somewhat disappeared. So that's the background. And that's maybe the reason why I'm offering you a drawing on the screen here. It is a fantasy. I was fascinated about game playing, still am, and I created all sorts of games, which of course nobody in their right mind will probably ever play. Here's a combination of live sheep, a cup of tea on every chair, and indeed the notion of 9 chairs, based upon notions of grids and permutations, some of which are indicated in the top right-hand corner. And in a way, at art school, it was my interest in game playing and its association essentially as drawing and as painting that gradually shifted to the notion of why necessarily keep these things static, why not suggest indeed they should have some movement. One of the very, very early films I made was called Drowning by Numbers, where I went back indeed to my childhood playgrounds, which were in the east of England, in Norfolk and Suffolk. And I made this film, I suppose, it wasn't the first or even the second or even the third feature film I made, but it was an attempt, I suppose, first self-consciously, to examine where I might have come from, what I was interested in, and how my creative sense developed. Let me show you just one or two small fragments from indeed that first film. You've got to be awake, but look, here are the sheep, here are the chairs, here are the teapots. And here is me in my bedroom at that time. And you can see the whole room is full of encyclopedia of relevances for my childhood.
Are stacked up into a castle in a draft-free space. The player can determine the dreams of the next night if he awakes before the castle collapses. Those players who wish to dream of romance build their castles with the 7 of hearts.
let me just play you that again. You can see the room is full of collected insects. I was a great Darwinianist, and I knew that Darwin collected insects, and so I certainly did. I was a great card player. You can see, again, all that notion of games within games. I'll play that to you again. And here's the landscape, an enormous excitement about notions of landscape. Again, as I'd mentioned, I'd often traveled to Holland with my father to birdwatch, and you know the Dutch landscape, certainly in the 17th and 18th century, was probably the most superior, certainly in Europe, and the English followed the Dutch in this respect. But the Dutch had extraordinary sort of definitions of landscape, like most of their landscapes from around about 1640, about the time of Rembrandt, were all subscribing to the idea of 2/3 sky and 1/3 land. I used to like those sort of definitions because they already gave you an introduction of how to perform. Okay, I'm going to put the soundtrack up again now and continue just to make an exploration again of the fact it was the painting that stimulated the notion, indeed, of the filmmaking. Here you can see a pencil drawing very largely, and if I were to give you an image like this, you could see maybe where some of the material came from. Every time an Englishman opens his or her voice, opens his mouth to speak, they say he is quoting Shakespeare. I don't know who your grand literary expert. If you're Italian, when you open your mouth, nobody actually speaks Italian. Everybody speaks Florentine, because that is the language of Dante Alighieri, certainly with the Divine Comedy. I suppose in Germany it's Goethe. I suppose Shakespeare in England would have to share space with the King James Bible of 1611, but that really is the beginnings of contemporary English. Think of that as an idea. Every time you open your mouth, you are using words that are shop-soiled by millions and millions of other people before you. Does that change your attitude to that? Or is that something you don't even remotely think about? But move that as a metaphor to the notions, indeed, of imagery. Every time you see an image, or every time, indeed, although from your experience so far, I understand that probably very few actually make images, there is a way that you are quoting. And I'm sure it's absolutely true of filmmakers, whether they know it or not. I've embarked recently on a whole series of projects, and maybe we can talk about them later, but I really do think that supposedly painting and filmmaking are all about images, but it's very, very sad that few painters talk to filmmakers, and few filmmakers ever talk or consider the huge heritage that exists in painting. If you go back to French cave painting, 45,000 years in Marseille. I suppose more frequently, probably most of the cave painting we've got from around the world is probably about 20,000 years old. But even 20,000 years compared to the history of cinema. Cinema created 1895, again, if you believe in the Lumiere brothers, and in 2015 that meant 120 years. So we're sort of comparing 12,000 years to 120. So maybe it's a bit churlish to complain that basically we have essentially a text-based cinema. We certainly don't have an image-based cinema, and maybe there certainly hasn't been time enough. But when you think about that and examine that, that cannot be true. Just think about how many millions and millions and millions of films have been made in the last 120 years, and even posit that against the notion of, should we say, the public availability of painting has probably only been relevant to the general public, not to the church and not to aristocrats, of course, since about the great beginnings of Western museum going, gallery creation. National Gallery in London, I think, when did that begin? About 1859. So let's say the 1850s. The Louvre in Paris is a bit older, probably goes back to certainly, I suppose, about 1820. But the availability to most people for most images of the last 8,000 years, let's make it even shorter, is very, very small. So take those two notions of a very popular art form indeed called cinema, and every nation in the world If cinema was invented in 1895, by 1910, every single nation that you can think of, even the smallest ones, if they didn't have a film industry, certainly had the possibility of being able to show films, even if it was only projected in a village in Nigeria on a sheet hung between two trees. I think there's only one system of communications that ever travel faster, and that has to be the internet. And I think that ability to travel so fast has been, in a sense, the big downside, both about cinema and certainly in some ways about the internet. You know, you talk about Japanese films, and you can make pointers saying how different they are from Hollywood. But when you really examine that situation, there isn't really that much difference at all. I think if you take Japanese painting, you will regard it very differently from the painting, indeed, of Western Europe. So if everything evolves slowly over a long period of time, involving hundreds of practitioners under different circumstances, then you can see that there's an enormous advantage in that sort of development. Okay, so with trying and without trying, consciously or unconsciously, when I want to portray a girl in skirts with a skipping rope, almost without trying, I would look therefore at Velasquez and then turn her into a filmic image.
You really could stick more out on the road. The road wasn't slap on the doorstep that way. My mother said I'm not to go out. It's dangerous. There are people mad out.
Okay, childhood, painting into cinema, beginnings. I'm talking about this in a very self-conscious way, and of course I can see it from hindsight, but necessarily some of these ideas were not present in the way I was thinking at that time. More paintings. Here, indeed, are pictograms, diagrams. Diagrams have always been a characteristic of my painting, of what you've just seen in a filmic form, and you can see here are close-ups which would intimately relate to this phenomenon.
Thanks, Steve. Alright, next. Off-stop crease. Then hand it back. Let down bowler.
Again, you've got to be smart and quick here, but you can see Bruegel's 100 children's games of 1400. You can see all the appurtenances again, certainly not only of cricket, but of game playing. You can see W.H. Grace, who's England's most famous cricketer, in the back here. You might even recognize the actor, whose name is Bernard Hill, last seen probably in Lord of the Rings.
With one eye closed before falling down the brilliant steps. Died in Bristol Municipal Bath, another black cross.
Organizations, classification. When I finally decided that I ought to have some practical knowledge about filmmaking, I suppose there were three areas open. One was certainly the camera. Because of my experience at art schools, I thought that probably that would be something that I could take to very easily. Another would probably be the whole business of the textual origins of cinema. I would offer to you, nobody in this room has ever seen a film that didn't start life as a text. There it is again, back to text again. I think it's absolutely essential that cinema of the future should separate itself. We really must cut that umbilical cord that connects cinema to the notion of the bookshop. I really think, probably in a melancholy moment, nobody in this room has ever seen a film. All you've seen is 120 years of illustrated text, which is not the same thing at all. But such is the rather cautious way that the major film industries of the world have relied upon text. We have a text-based cinema, we don't have an image-based cinema. However many images you see, they're always a secondary adjunct. They come afterwards. Again, you can see the comparisons here, which are related perhaps to our rather constipated examination of historical sources. Here is my fascination with the Norfolk-Suffolk landscape. It's extremely flat, it's rather like Holland, and they have to have lots of water towers in order to get the water pressure to be able to be felt in your kitchen and your bathroom. And again, that would be superintended and organized by the imagination of a young Greenaway learning his way around that landscape.
A great many things are dying very violently all the time. The best days for violent deaths are Tuesdays. They are the yellow paint days. Saturdays are second best, or worst. Saturdays are red paint days. The great death game is therefore a contest between red paint days and yellow paint days. So far, yellow paint days are winning by 31 corpses to 29. Whatever the colour, a violent death is always celebrated by a firework.
He's dead.
Okay, you can see, I think this actor here, I think he's much younger than I suppose I was when I first decided to be so fascinated indeed by what I regard as the only two subject matters worth talking about. One is sex and the other is death. What else is there significant to talk about? There are 7 billion people in the world, and you are part of that. There are only basically two things that I know about you, and I'm absolutely convinced I know them. First of all, two people fucked to make you, and I'm very, very sorry, but you're all going to die. Everything else is up to education, economic circumstances, notions of national identity, and very, very freewheeling. So surely, these two major subject matters, which are true about a Japanese as they are about a North American Red Indian, and although there are all sorts of differences about the way of death, and certainly about notions of birth and concepts of love, these two basic factors are really desperately important. And they are the subject of all religion. They are the subject, basically, of all culture, of all art. I would imagine that probably art is really about sex, and I'm being very dangerously simplistic here, but religion's all about death. This dichotomy, I suppose, has informed practically all of my subject matter in all of my films, and it still continues. We've just made a film about the great film director, Russian-Soviet Eisenstein, and it was certainly his preoccupations. But you have only got to scratch the surface, indeed, of any system, any schema, any notion of a template, and I'm sure sooner or later you're going to come back to these particular situations. And here, at this time, this film was probably made at the beginning of the 1980s, and I was not particularly self-consciously aware of such things, but indeed, this is the beginnings. So, creating an examination of my schoolboy self, already there are intimations, indeed, of what's going to fascinate me and continue to excite me for the rest, indeed, of my career, and I was 75 last week. Going back, I mentioned the fact that the interest that my father had in natural landscape was very much focused on the notion of birds. I was the eldest son, thinking of eatable problems, etc. He came back from the war, I think, quite late in 1946, and he already found a 3-year-old young boy totally vying for his wife, my mother's, attention. And I think that that was a stamp that continued, in a sense, for the rest of my career, my life, and indeed my brother's life. And of course, all these men returning from the Second World War soon made their wives pregnant again, and I soon had a brother, and inevitably the associations and attractions. And I think really in a peculiar way I'm quoting my mother about this. These insights would never have been alive to me until much, much later. The inevitable eatable problems would exist between myself and my brother, and the possibilities of dialogue between myself and my father were extraordinarily thin on the ground. But like I said before, with my own children, picking up my interests without necessarily being very self-conscious about it, I also, of course, was interested in birds, but I didn't want to particularly, as it were, follow completely in my father's footsteps. So if my father was interested in birds, I was going to be interested in something associated with, which was essentially what those birds ate. But I'm thinking of insectivorous birds. So if he collected birds, I collected insects. There's a whole series of paintings and drawings at that time, which are relative indeed to ornithological subject matter. And I began to make very short films. I'm talking now about the 1960s. This film is called A Walk Through H, which in a sense is the beginnings of a sort of understanding who I thought my father was. The music here is by a reputed English composer called Michael Nyman.
Tuesday morning early at about 1:45. This particular map had at one time been very familiar to me. I had always associated it with night. Perhaps the map that hung on a bedroom wall somewhere. I forget. Once past it, it was impossible to go back. I had heard that one or two had been able to turn back just before they reached Castigar, but that was rare. The second city was Campoliupis. This was one of the catalogue drawings. I bought a lot of them surreptitiously and kept them in a suitcase. The paper was poor stuff. Ascodin. It was in two parts, both of them silent. I remember this man came with a letter accusing me of stealing eggs. I had never understood the relationship of the map to the accusation. I still don't, but I'm grateful for the map. After Ascodin came Manavia, 34 miles from Castigar. The road was very clearly marked, very red. This drawing, I remember, illustrated a theory about blood oranges, or perhaps it was about pomegranates. The fifth city was Maladrone. This drawing was a frontispiece to a novel by Asper Fulbats called The Winged Woman. Fulbats was a pioneer naturalist, one of the first to promote the ringing of birds and check on their movements. After some 20 years of this practice, in which time Fulbats and his wife must have ringed some 25,000 birds, he decided that the information gained was not to be trusted. He came to the conclusion that information from a ringed bird was not the same as information from a bird. Fulbats tried to curb the enthusiasm he had helped to pioneer, and half in earnest, half in jest, to draw a behavioral parallel, he wrote his erotic novel in which the heroine is ringed. Fulbats' wife did the illustrations, but they never appeared when the novel was published. Where this illustration fits in the novel is not clear.
A map is an extraordinary phenomenon, isn't it? It tells you where you've been, where you are, and where you're going. And there's a way, of course, that maps are also extraordinary metaphors for things which have got nothing to do about geography. And also, I think that it's very much a notion of a palimpsest to the way that my filmmaking was maneuvering. But to go back again with this search for a personal identity, as it were exploring it in childhood and early adolescence, and still wishing to discover this, what I thought key to myself would have been my relationship to my father. So I continued in a way to fictionalize my father and put him in a series of films. This is a clip where he plays the central character, who is both very, very innocent, which I thought my father was, but also concomitantly also very, very arrogant. And that curious mixture of innocence and arrogance I took to be part of my birthright. Let me show you a clip where indeed I have fashioned my father playing the most extraordinary, handsome, beautifully dressed character in a revenge drama of 1694 in a film called The Draughtsman's Contract.
hilltop prospecting the estate to the north of the house will be kept clear of all members of the household staff and farm servants. Such animals as are presently grazing in the fields will be permitted to continue to do so.
Good day, Mr. Neville, Mr. Tubman. I see you have selected a fine view for my son to inherit.
I prefer, for the moment at least, to regard the view as the property of Mr. Herbert.
This film was made 1982, about the year 1694, Married Woman's Property Act, the changeover from the Stuarts to the Dutch William and Mary, very much related to ideas of historical identity at those times, very, very extravagant costume making, of course, reproduced lovingly by all sorts of people who were prepared somewhat to fictionalize the situation. But again, now I'm beginning very self-consciously to examine the notion of the frame. The frame is no accident, though the frame does not exist in nature. The frame is essentially a totally artificial phenomenon, certainly coming from notions of painting, round about the beginning of the Renaissance, when painting separated itself from architecture, and of course the theatre with the proscenium arch copied the frame, and then obviously the cinema copied the theatre, and then television and magazine, books, and so on and so on. Isn't it extraordinary? We all look very largely at representational imagery through a parallelogram, 4 right angles. That has now become so fixed all over the world, even in countries which didn't believe in such activity, like in Asia. We are now all, as it were, pinned into this notion. Well, if it is so important, and if it does rigorously demand the way we look at representation, then let's really be self-conscious about it and really use it. And you will see with these images how the framing is really rigorously very important. I want to be able to tell you, look at the frame. The frame is artificial. You will not, your eyes, I don't see you in a frame and you don't see me in a frame. We see, again, one another in a very, very organic shape, and of course that's always moving. All of us have gyroscopic heads and our eyes never stop. So the notion of anything static being a frame is totally, totally artificial. To the profound artificialities about cinema, it's all in a frame, and let me repeat, there's no such thing as a frame in nature, and also it has this notion of a staticness, which again is absolutely impossible with our human anatomy. Let me just show you this image again. Look at the frame and realize that the draftsman, who again is a representation, if you like, of my father, is looking at the world through a frame. Historically, these frames really existed. Leonardo da Vinci certainly used one. All manner of Baroque artists certainly used one, and they were in use in English landscape painting round about 1650. Frames within frames. Look where the draftsman comes from. He's within a frame. The bridge is making a frame. There it is, an optical device used quite popularly by landscape artists round about 1650. And here again, very much part of the discipline of the draftsman is this determination to work within a set procedure. Remember, I told you about this fascination fascination I had with the Dutch definition of landscape, which had to be 2/3 sky, 1/3 land. Again, this notion of participating, segmenting, organizing the picture space in terms of, if you like, equations, precepts, notions again of the understanding of space is relative very much to the disciplines that I would like to use when making films. A lot of my films, it has been noticed, really are basically catalogues. They're catalogues of a situation, of variations on a theme. Again, I suppose if you think of those of you who might have seen The Cook, Thief, His Wife and the Lover, it's really based upon 8 sets of meals in one, a restaurant. So menu 1, menu 2, menu 3, menu 4. I made a film called Zed Two Noughts, which was based upon the 8 general, I suppose, Darwinian evolutionary periods. I made a film about the Pillar Book, the Japanese film I mentioned, which again was related to systems of numbering. I made a film called Drowning by Numbers. It essentially was a film where you could tick off the numbers from 1 to 100. It was deliberately organized to make you very self-conscious of time passing, so you knew when the number 50 came up on the screen, you were exactly halfway through the film. It was a godsend to some people who didn't like the film at all, but realized when you got to 50, there were only 50 more to come. There was I suppose, quite sort of ironic thing with the numbers on the frame. They weren't written, as it were, on the surface of the frame. They were embedded either in its dialogue or in its soundtrack or in some significant artifact on the screen, so much so that we were actually painting numbers on the back of insects. So you had to watch very, very carefully. People were very keen to say, you missed out number 31. Oh, you missed out 87. No, look carefully. When you watch a Greenaway film, you really have to watch very, very carefully. I will tell you how this became so obsessional that in a sense it often created notions of incomprehensibility. But enough of that, we'll talk about that again. Continuing then still to examine the notion of self in my definition of my relationship to my father, we made a film called The Belly of an Architect, which was very much indeed about Roman architecture, and the structure there were the 8 periods of classical architecture which are present even now when you go to Rome, going all the way from the early days of the Republic right up until fascism. Take a look at this.
Figs if I were you, lady. Now see, they're aphrodisiacs. You don't look like you're up to it to me, I'm sorry. They should eat in company. See? I have to eat in company. My wife was eating company all the time. Like my wife was eating company. I like eating company. We're all the same, are we? Huh? Come on, we're all the same. We speak a different language. We have the same metabolism. No. See, the difference is. See, I'm interested in skin bellies. See, you have a belly. There's your belly right there. See? I'm sorry. How did I say stomach? Stomach. Stomach and mixed company. Okay. Come over here. Come on, you have a belly too. Hey, see? Hey, you got a belly? See? I got a belly. I'll tell you what. I'll show you mine if you show me yours. There's mine, okay? No. But see, what the difference is saying? Yours a little larger than yours. See, the difference is mine is being eaten away. See, mine is rotting away from the inside. You understand what I'm saying? No. I'm talking to the lady here. So put your hand up here. Come on, touch it. It won't bite you. It only bites me. It's cancer, see? It's cancer. They have cancer. Stomach cancer. Cancer. Jesus Christ himself would have died of stomach cancer. If you people hadn't crucified him first! That's right!
Okay, one more essay, I suppose, in filmic terms of trying to create some self-identity vis-a-vis my relationship with my father was indeed in the film The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover. And the rather good English actor Michael Gambon portrays this really incredibly evil character. One of the reasons for me making the film was to see, in fact, if I could break the mold. You know, always the really evil character is the one that really, really fascinates us. And that classic Milton Paradise Lost phenomenon, the most exciting character in Milton's Paradise Lost, of course, is Satan. We are deeply, deeply intrigued and relish the evilness. I don't know, Dan even say that, but certain contemporary presidents might attract us in the same way. There is a way, though, that the film develops. It's very much about cannibalism, but cannibalism as a metaphor that becomes real on the grounds that our materialism is so considerable that when we have finally eaten up everything in the world, we will literally end up eating ourselves. So there was a way that parts of my father's attitude, indeed, to himself, to me, to civilization, the world, could be wrapped up in a certain sort of innocent, arrogant, I've used those two words already, which I was beginning to think was also part of my particular character. Take a look at the personification then of a rather downside, last-ditch attempt to rid myself, I suppose, of the melancholy relationship that I had with my father.
A stranger, special invitations, which I might say could have gone to a better printer. Like the bang on the door, like an outcome. Whoa. Georgina Duck. What brings you here, you bitch? I'm very surprised you're so gracefully show your face here, you
Where have you been, Georgina? Albert has been frantic.
Shut up, Grace, find me a drink.
At the anniversary.
I'll bloody kill you for what you did to me.
Well, I wish you'd find that easy.
And don't think I'm taking you back on that you play, you slut. Your bottom's going to be very, very sore for weeks. No more books for you, girl. You're staying in under lock and key for me no more books or prick sniffing for you, girl.
Happy anniversary, Albert.
What are you talking about, happy anniversary? It's not my birthday.
No, that's true, but it's an anniversary that I shall always celebrate, even if you won't. And you won't.
What are you talking about? Where is it?
Well, they'll be here presently.
Look, Georgina. It's all over now. Look, Grace, look, just go and look out of the window or something. It's all battle about it. Look, Georgina, when the others arrive. Where are they? It says 9 o'clock on the invitation. Where are they going to sit?
They'll be here presently.
Georgina, you didn't really like it, did you? You know, I reckon you like a bloody bookkeeping. Oh, Bonnie! Look, I'll tell you what. I'll try, but we'll forget it. And come. Tell you the truth, Georgie. I've been looking at some more.
Since it is your anniversary,
What bloody anniversary?
I bought you a present.
I don't need presents. It's me who gives you presents. You've always known that. Besides, you've never had the money to give me a present.
And Richard has cooked it. Under my instructions.
Oh.
Knowing how you like to eat. Knowing how you like to gorge yourself. And we've brought a few of your friends in.
Okay, for those people who haven't seen the film, I'm going to really spoil it to you now because I'm going to show you the ending, which brings together indeed all these ideas of notions of, I suppose, retribution ideas, which will be relative certainly to a whole series of Christian ideas, along with all the other preoccupations that have been concerning myself. You can already see the incredible insistence on color organization, making you realize that this is really film as much about color and all the emotional, intellectual associations, but also the historical implications. I don't know whether you noticed, but there's a very large painting by Franz Hals on the wall in the background of this restaurant, painted in about 1642, and there's a permeation of where the historical extravagance of these civil guard paintings of the war that Holland was fighting against the Habsburgs in Madrid, which has permeated indeed the costume of everybody. You can see the costumes are deliberately artificial to make that particular point. The costumes were created by Jean-Paul Gaultier, and it was he who was suggested should indeed look at the paintings of Franz Hals and take a sense of continuity of that, because one of the fascinations I have is not to make films, as it were, date specific, but also to indicate the continuity of history both before and afterwards. I suppose you would need to think about the things that history always repeats itself. There is a cyclic activity about notions of good and evil, which are always repetitive. And I suppose, you know, the big dramatic, certainly in English and French terms, about revenge drama is always repeatable. So just take a look at the ending of this film.
What's going on?
Sit down, Albert. Don't have to sit down, Georgina. No, this is Albert's special treat.
Yeah. I'm not eating with that Roy there.
Shut up, Albert. You're here to enjoy yourself.
Okay. Jesus! Come.
That's not God, Albert. It's Michael. My lover. You vowed you would kill him. And you did. And you vowed you would eat him. Now eat him. What's the matter, Albert? You have your knife and fork. You do know how to use them. Or have all those carefully learnt table manners gone to waste? Mitchell can pour you a drink. Your waiter has opted out. Grace will pour for you.
Yeah.
Eat Albert. Roy, pour Albert a drink. Try the cock, Albert. It's delicacy. And you know where it's been. Go on, Albert. Eat. Bon appétit. It's French.
Okay, preposterous situation, very, very, very heavy on metaphor, but you can see all the other parts of the language happening as well. The symmetry, the framing, the color coding, the use of the relationship of the dialogue to the music, etc. Very, very self-conscious. I always enjoy cinema which has that sense of self-consciousness, and if I can make it personal, related again to the notion of self. When you watch a Greenaway film, I want you to be very aware that you are watching a Greenaway film. This is not a slice of life, it's not a window on the world, it's not a piece of escapism, it's not therapy, although you might become, I suppose, in some ways associated with that notion. It is an artifice. And a work of art is deliberately, I believe, most successful when you are aware that it is indeed an artifice. Okay, let me move on then maybe to perhaps the central thing that I want to discuss, which is a huge project which we started probably in about the year 2000, so it was very much a millennial project, which was meant to be an encapsulation, essentially a film of its time. I had made probably about 50 films by then. We're talking, I suppose, about early 1990s. All sorts of different films, certainly feature films, you've seen some clips, but loads of films which were devised for particular occasions and particular commissions. Galleries, installations, certainly a lot of documentaries and a lot of experimental films. So I wanted to make a film for the information age, an encyclopedic film for the information age, which would gather up, in a sense, all the world's information and put it in one place. I've always been fascinated by the notion of the encyclopedia. I suppose, Diderot and D'Alembert, just before the French Revolution, the classic French encyclopedists, who were determined, and of course they had a political and didactic and instructional point of view, which was very much to educate and instruct, a project which was much despised by all those people who didn't think that women and the proletariat should have too much knowledge because they wouldn't be able to deal with it, and before very long there would be a revolution. And of course they were very prophetic because the French Revolution then happened soon afterwards in 1789. But when you examine this idea of putting all the world's knowledge in one place, and I suppose you would be thinking indeed very much of historical characters. Let's take Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, as you all know, I'm sure, got nothing to do with the Roman Empire, but to do with his presages for the future of the British Empire. Going back to something I said earlier this afternoon, that all historians have got vested interests, and in a sense there's no such thing as pure history, and it is people putting forward their own subjectivity to, as it were, play the games of their own hobby horse. But if you think about the possibility of doing this self-consciously or not self-consciously, let's think of some more examples. Let's think of the 36 plays of Shakespeare. I don't think that Shakespeare realized what, in a sense, retrospectively, he was doing. There is a consensus of opinion, I suppose, that if you take all 36 plays of Shakespeare, you're doing a great encyclopedia of human emotions. Nothing ever gets left out. You know, Othello's about jealousy, Hamlet's about retrospection, and you know how to play that game. But if you think of other people, let's take Dante Alighieri with the Divine Comedy. Very self-conscious, I think, beautifully organized, all based on the number 3, 33 cantos, 3 books, obviously associated with the Holy Trinity in Christian terms, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, but also deeply imbued, of course, in Roman and Greek history. I think pretty certainly that Dante knew that he was creating a really non-perishable work of literature. Let's move across. Let's take Einstein. We all know that even recently his last papers are still being examined for the attempts he was trying to make a unifying theory of all the laws of the universe. You could be more humble, I suppose, and think about all those diary makers. I'm thinking of the Englishman Johnson, who made the first English dictionary. The idea of putting, again, all the notion of information in one place, to collate, to organize, to construct a system and a structure whereby we could help to not only understand the world and civilization, but our place in it. Okay, are these things pre-planned, or are they only seen in retrospect, as it were, accidentally, under the horizons of history? Well, it might be an extraordinary, both innocent and arrogant, and remember I've used those two phrases over and over again about my relationship to my father and also his character, and maybe retrospectively about me, so maybe it is also both an innocent and an arrogant suggestion that such a thing would be possible. To make, for the beginning of the 21st century, and again, numbers, again, are always of great fascination to us, if you think about Jewish Kabbalah, for example, and they would always bear fruit when times get particularly, I suppose, significant. I'm now about to embark on a program about the Reformation. Again, in a Jewish context, almost totally irrelevant. But I'm making a documentary about Martin Luther, who I would treat very, very negatively. But I'm also making a feature film called The Marriage of Christ about the Counter-Reformation, the Council of Trent, taking place, I suppose, the first half of what right up till, well, certainly Peace of Westphalia in 1648. So there's a way that the notion again of history encapsulating, of putting everything tidily in place, absolutely impossibility. But I think because there are so many examples of people trying to do that, and isn't a great work of art, isn't Beethoven's Fifth, isn't Zola's, well, let's take Flaubert, Madame Bovary, for example. They become notions of complete encyclopedias of a time, of an attitude, particular notion of a certain human conscription. So, I wanted to make a project which said everything about contemporary technology in terms of filmic activity, certainly everything coming out of Silicon Valley, and to make a project for the digital age. Most of the films that I've shown you clips from would come from the notion of the celluloid cinema. I believe an enormous break happened between the death of celluloid cinema. I don't think there are any self-respecting filmmakers, possible exception of that film snob and Hollywood lover Tarantino, who still insists on making films in a very old-fashioned way in terms of celluloid. But all, shall we say, sensible, serious filmmakers are now essentially all part of the digital revolution. So I wanted to make a demonstration of my enthusiasm and excitement about this brand new language, so to use all sorts of new equipments, new sort of literary ways of looking at things which were essentially about images, but also I wanted to put it, in a sense, in a very contemporary situation. So it really is, I suppose, the big phenomenon of my life, which has been the subject of uranium. So this whole project really is about a history, both fictional, real, literal, and metaphorical, about the history of uranium. So the history of uranium, seen against the backdrop of all the notions of European history that we've seen from about 1930, certainly way beyond the attempts to get rid of the notions of uranium. Uranium, of course, was the symbol very much of the atomic bomb in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And I still think it's certainly not going to go away. We're going to have to seriously still continue that. The world is shaking itself, is it not? Introduction of a new American president, with all the new antagonisms, and still the uranium, the atomic threat, still hangs over us. If we manage to arrange things profitably in the upside, then harnessing a true positive attitude towards uranium and all its relatives and associations will be extraordinarily beneficial, because we will have energy to supply our refrigerators and our rocket ships for the rest of time. But if the whole thing goes desperately wrong, then Armageddon, and that's the end of us. I suppose, the contemporary concerns that young people would have now will be very much about pollution and overpopulation. They stand perhaps even more far forward than the people of my generation would have been in the 60s about the notions of atomic power, but it's going to have to come back, and we're going to have to deal with it. So I wanted to talk about all these different attitudes towards the notion, indeed, of atomic power. But again, let me stress, I wanted to talk about it in the terms of very contemporary activities as regards the visual imagination. It was an enormous project. I wanted to make a film. In fact, I wanted to make 92 films. You might know the atomic number of uranium is 92. An impossible activity. I could never command huge budgets, and who would be interested in all the implausibilities and the difficulties of making such a product. But I also wanted to make a whole series of operas about it, and we made 3. I wanted to make a whole series of documentaries, and there are about 6. I wanted to make a whole library of books, and I think I'm now up to book 64, and there were going to be 92 of these books. And also we were going to put it into all sorts of other interactive television series. A lot of these things, over a period of 5 years, we managed in one way or another, directly or indirectly, to put together on this extremely, let me keep repeating these 2 words, innocent, arrogant proposition. Let me show you just the very, very beginning of the first of 3 films we made, and I suppose this is the background to the whole project, which continued for about 5 years, and we did end up, in fact, with 3 feature films. One was shown at the Berlin Film Festival, one was shown at the Cannes Film Festival, and one was shown in Venice. It became an extraordinary festival film. People were very, very intrigued in the whole concept, but I have to tell you, and I'll tell you now, the film was a total disaster in public cinema. It was described as being far too soon for its time. It concerned itself with interactivity, and we know that public cinema is a democratic association. Look at you, you're in a cinema environment, and there must be at least 50 people in the room, and you're all going to want something different. How can you organize a singular activity which is going to be, in internet terms, satisfactory? But to give you some idea of the complexity and of the ambition, let me show you the very beginning of the first film, which is also, well, not necessarily coincidentally, an introduction.
I've seen you just pooping and snooping, just pooping and snooping, Mr. Looper. Mr. Looper. Mr. Looper. With that pair of first class, quality class binoculars. Made in Germany. Made in Germany.
Good morning, Mr. Looper. Good morning, Mr. Looper. Mr. Looper, open your mouth. I'm the station dentist. Open your mouth. Open your mouth. says, good man,
That says man, Mr. Luca. It says man falls from the age of a little hot cheap suitcase along with the Holy Bible.
Good morning, Mr. Luca.
I am the station master.
Good morning, Mr. Luca.
I am the station master.
Good morning, Mr. Luca.
I am the station master.
Good morning, Mr. Luca. I am the station master.
I am the station.
Good morning, Mr. Luca. I am the station master.
Good morning, Mr. Cooper. I am the station master. Good morning, Mr. Luca. I am the station master.
If we wanted to see that ultimately the story is fiction, it could be told as an episodic narrative of a man and his prison. The story starts in 1921 when Luca was 10, and perhaps it is still not finished. Luca was last seen and heard of, we believe, in 1989. If he were to be alive now, he would be 92.
Okay, so you can see the introduction again, back to childhood again. All takes place in Newport, Wales, where indeed I was born. So it recapitulates that, but you can see the language is very, very, shall we say, complex, to say the least. I was anticipating, I suppose, the notion of interactive cinema, where you, the audience, could stop and rewind and run things slowly. There are all sorts of devices, like every character, and there are 92 characters in the film, is played by 92 different people. I was fascinated, if you take classic cinema, think of all the people who played Napoleon, think of all the people who played Hitler. Let's put them all together, make an examination. What is truth, what is fiction? What is the nature of history and how it's fixing it? And again, you can see this rather old-fashioned idea of a cinema which is one idea at a time. You certainly, as human beings, don't operate like that. When you walk down the street, the sense of imagery, the combination of your memory, the imagination, and the circumstances of your walk are all having a really intense association with you as a person. I was ambitiously trying to make that work in terms of cinema. Whether your discipline's fascinations and interests are associated with mine, but I think you can see that the things that I've certainly discussed and talked about in terms of what some people have regarded as the seventh art form. I don't believe that cinema deserves to be called that. Either, as I suggested in the beginning, it's far too young, we have a long way to go, but I also think it's already over. I think cinema is now dead. Godard has been saying this for at least 30 years. Even Mr. Tarantino has been saying it. I think he said it at the last Cannes Film Festival. You know, let me ask you two quick questions to round up. Is there anybody in the room who still looks at silent cinema? There were 34 years of silent cinema, and it's hardly ever looked at. I'm quite convinced that the rest of cinema will go the same way. And do you think, and I'm sure most of you watch your films on a thing like this, and you probably watch them when you're on your own, in your bed, in your office, or in your front room. Gone seem to be the days when large numbers of people all saw the same thing at the same time on screens which are bigger and louder than you are. Indications to me, though I don't think we ought to be unhappy about it, that cinema is very rapidly on the way out. And if you come to my second lecture, which I hope to give in about 2 hours' time, I want to offer various ways, maybe we can, as it were, associate with the title of that lecture, which is "The Cinema is Dead, Long Live the Cinema." Thank you.